Welcome back. That growing feud this weekend between President Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Former Milwaukee Mayor Tom Barrett arrived in Luxembourg just weeks after the Russian invasion and served as U.S. ambassador to Luxembourg until the end of President Biden's term. He's been home now for about a month, and he joins us now. Welcome back to Milwaukee. Welcome back to the show. It's great to see you.
It's great to be here. There's no place like home.
No place like home. You've been home for several weeks now. I want to start where we are today first. Now, as a former ambassador to the region, critical allies across Europe. What do you make of these first 4 weeks of the Trump administration?
Well, it's very interesting because by far one of the most amazing things about being in Luxembourg is how much they appreciate the role the United States played in saving that country in World War II. It was amazing. It was amazing. And you go to these small communities in the northern part of the country where the Battle of the Bulge took place, essentially right there and in Belgium. And there are many, many American flags, tributes, and you come away at times thinking, oh my gosh, they like us more than we like ourselves. And as I was leaving in December, it was the 80th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge. So we had many members of Congress come, we had many dignitaries there, and the outflowing of love and support of the United States was overwhelming. So now I have to say, and this might sound caustic to some, it almost appears as though President Trump in 8 weeks wants to destroy the goodwill that took us 80 years to build. Because there's huge concerns right now in Europe as to what this long-term, deep friendship between the United States and the European Union will become if, instead of wanting to look to the Europe as an ally, President Trump wants to look to Russia or North Korea or wherever. So I'd be lying if I didn't say there's huge concern there right now.
At the same time, in your final weeks, in your final months in Luxembourg, was there concern in Europe about President Biden's age and his ability to lead the U.S.?
Well, I would say not at the end because clearly he was out of the race by then. But I would say a year ago, prior to when he left the race, there was certainly that concern. Without a doubt, there was that concern. There was a feeling that his heart was in the right place, that he wanted to maintain this strong relationship. But there was a lot of concern about whether physically he was up to the job.
When that all was happening, that debate, him dropping out of the race, what was going through your mind and what were the conversations like in Europe?
What was going through my mind, I did not watch the debate. And I didn't watch the debate for my own mental health because I thought, I don't know what's going to happen. And
You were concerned?
I was concerned. I was concerned. To this moment, I haven't watched that debate because I just had concerns. Now, I'll say that and say that the interactions that I had with him during my time as ambassador, which were few, but 2 or 3, he was sharp as a tack. So clearly there was something that was going on there. I did not sense in the one-on-one interactions that there was an issue, but there may have been and there may not have been. But obviously, from all the news reports, that debate was clearly a turning point in his presidency and led to him getting out of the race.
Did that make your job harder in the final months?
No, in some ways it made it easier because that was off the table. That was off the table. And with Vice President Harris in the race, I think that there was hope and there was enthusiasm for her, quite honestly, in Europe, that she could win the race. There was always this fear with President Trump. The fear was there, and it was not below the surface.
President Trump has named Stacey Feinberg the new ambassador to Luxembourg. She was a campaign donor, investor, a producer. Have you spoken to her?
I have not spoken to her. I certainly would be happy to speak with her if she wants to. When I was appointed by President Biden, I reached out to 2 of the former Republican ambassadors and 2 of the former Democratic ambassadors because it's a nonpartisan job. So I wanted to get the Democratic take and the Republican take. I don't know whether she's going to do it. That's obviously her decision. I'd be happy to talk to her, but if she decides or if the president's team decides that they don't want to talk to any former ambassadors, I understand that as well.
What advice would you give her?
Work with the people. They're good people there. They're smart people. Again, it's a very wealthy country. The other issue that we really had to focus on was their relationship with China. Because this is a time when the United States is basically putting its foot on the gas pedal, on the brake, to slow down, not to stop, but to slow down our relationship with China. There were signs that it was putting its foot on the gas pedal to have more engagement. And so just to make sure that everybody had their eyes wide open as to what was going on with the relationship with China.
What's next for Tom Barrett?
That's a really good question. I'm very relaxed right now. I have no plans right now, and I don't know. I mentioned that it's halftime. It's a wonderful halftime. I don't know what's in the second half.
Halftime, does that mean political office?
I don't know. If you ask my wife sitting here, she would say, not on your life. I'm incapable of ever saying never, but I don't know. I really don't know.
If Governor Evers doesn't run in 26, there could be an open
governor's. I think that ship has sailed.
Okay.
That's my gut tells me that ship has sailed. But I think he's doing a great job. I hope he runs again.
Former ambassador to Luxembourg, the former mayor of Milwaukee, Tom Barrett, welcome home. Thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
It's great to be here. Thank you, Matt. Thank you very much.
Up next, countdown to the NFL draft in Green Bay. Jaron's back with the new look around Lambeau and the potential new state funding. Next.